Hello everyone, I'm Flip Pideaux, and welcome to this first ever Election Whisperer mailbag special. It's a full hour of our favorite segment, The Doc Is In, and I am here with the host of the Election Whisperer, forecaster extraordinaire, the one and only Rachel Bitecofer. Rachel, how's it going?
It's going, Flip. I'm excited to get through some of these mailbag questions. They've just been so great, and I have felt bad that we haven't been able to get through more of them, so...
I know the folks at home have been sending in so many great questions week after week that Rachel simply can't keep pace with them in our normal episodes. So we are pleased to bring you this mailbag marathon today. And if you have a question that you'd like Rachel to answer in an upcoming episode or special, you can visit us at electionwhisperer.com, where you can submit your question, subscribe to the channel, catch up on back episodes, and so on. With that, let's jump right in. Rachel, you ready for the first question?
I am ready. I was born ready, Flip.
Okay, well, we're going to start off with a couple of related questions. A number of people have been writing in this week about Georgia. And let's start with Tom Recht, who asks, how much effect would an Abrams VP pick have on the Georgia Senate races? Would it make them truly competitive? Meanwhile, Jack Madden asks, could you do a special on Georgia, maybe Texas, preferably Georgia, because due to these protests, the African Americans and the educated people in suburbs will be activated, I hope. Thank you and can't wait for your show to start. Similarly, Kevin Gita writes, you often preach about turnout, and evidently that's where the real battle is when it comes to Election Day. I want to know, in your opinion, do the turnout numbers in Georgia make you feel optimistic about a flip in November?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad people are talking about Georgia. I think Georgia has really demonstrated a clear propensity to be a strong toss-up competitive state, both at the presidential level and really in this especially this special Senate election. A lot of people probably don't know this about Georgia, but Georgia's got this weird rule, and that is that in every contest, primary or otherwise, the winner has to clear 50%. If they don't, they have a runoff. And they do that. Actually, it's a rule that keeps spoilers from happening. So, interestingly, if we had that rule nationally, the 2016 election would have had to been rerun between Clinton and Trump, because neither of them cleared 50%. And then that third party vote would have had to choose somebody else, right? So we could have had a whole different outcome. So in Georgia, what's interesting is the special Senate election, which is a election that's being held. The seat is currently held by an appointed Kelly Loeffler. She was appointed over really like a pretty contested, like the mainstream of the party wanted to fill it with somebody they thought would be attractive to suburban women. Obviously, they're bleeding very badly there in the Atlanta suburbs. The grassroots of the party wanted the seat to go to Doug Collins, who's a member of Georgia's House of Representatives, congressional delegation. And when they didn't get what they wanted, they ended up running Collins in this open contest. So the way it works, there's never a primary. The primary is essentially the general. You've got a slew of candidates from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They're all running in this general in November. And if the winning candidate doesn't clear 50, then there'll be a runoff that happens in January. So the Democrats have an opportunity, if they can consolidate support around their kind of favored son, which is a minister named Raphael Warnock, who's kind of Stacey Abrams' selected favorite, given that she didn't want to run in the Senate race, and not have their vote splinter, and they can turn out a lot of voters, they might have a situation where Collins and Loeffler split so much of the Republican vote that they can thread the needle. And then on top of that, of course, in 2016, of the real solid red states, there were two, Arizona and Georgia, that came very close to actually breaking for Clinton. And especially in Georgia, as you all know, there was that close Georgia gubernatorial race. I mean, very close, razor close. So we really are looking at potential toss-up situation. I do actually, and I'm very much in the minority here, do think the vice president matters, though. I do think that if he goes with a female person of color, that it will help in the margins in a state like Georgia pull up that turnout. Of course, Raphael Warnock is, I should point out, a candidate of color too. So that will definitely help, in my opinion, in that Georgia, diversity aspect. And, I think that's going to also be a factor in South Carolina, frankly, with Jamie Harrison. I think like when you're trying to get voters of color are excited, especially in this moment right now. now with the George Floyd murders, really like getting people to realize how hungry Black voters are for representation. So it's not just a matter of, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have Kamala Harris or somebody like that on the ticket? It is a strong urging for voice. And yes, I realize Obama was the president, but that doesn't mean it's a one and done, right? We're looking for sustained change and representation for voters of color in the Democratic Party. And so I do think it would matter who the vice presidential candidate is in that regard in Georgia. And as the other question asked about the primary turnout, that primary turnout was a major tell. It tells you the organizational efforts that have been put in that state since 2016 that we first saw manifest kind of pay dirt in 2018 with Abrams' run has only been doubled down on since then. And it was just a really astounding turnout in that primary. And Democrats don't need to dominate the primary to have a strong general, but in places where they do, that's usually a really good sign. So, Georgia's just going to be, I think, a state to watch in 2020.
So another area where we got a number of viewer questions is about the Lincoln Project, which of course you were involved in. I think we had a lot of feedback that was inspired by our recent episode with Rick Wilson from the Lincoln Project as well. And Lorraine Davis asks or requests, please discuss the Lincoln Project ads and what makes them effective or not. Meanwhile, Ralph Mailer says, I'm curious about you joining the Lincoln Project. It seems your main thesis in this age of polarization is motivating base turnout, while the Never Trump founders of the Lincoln Project are more about converting disaffected moderates and conservatives. Both approaches appear persuasive, Ralph says. I know you have the numbers. On the other hand, Biden's recent polling improvement seems to be in Republican-leaning independents. There is still a coming home of disaffected Sanderites happening as well. So Ralph asks, are you and Rick Wilson able to inform each other? That is, will the advice be both and rather than either or?
Yes, I'm just going to kind of mesh these questions up into one pie and mix them up. So the Lincoln Project, as some of you guys know, I'm a senior advisor on the Lincoln Project. I'm not a principal, so I'm not, in the room where it happens when they're cutting these ads or anything like that. But I do, have a pretty good sense of what they're up to and what they're doing because I'm on the board. But it's a multi-pronged strategy. So they are, making some ads that are geared towards persuasion. And some of those ads are straight up. I mean, I think honestly, if you watch the Lincoln Project town hall that happened a couple nights ago, and I really suggest that you do if you haven't already. It was very, very interesting. They describe their earnest desire to win over the hearts and minds of actual card-carrying Republicans with these ads. But, for me, I think that they have a ton of valiance with independence or right-leaning independence, I think is really where they're really going to be hitting home mostly in the election cycle. So I think persuasively, they're very powerful. And some of the ads are geared towards that. So it's not just the ones that you see on Twitter, which are sometimes, they're putting out content, so many different ads. I mean, sometimes it's a couple a day, but the ones that make it on TV are selected for the purpose of, I think, persuading voters. So Morning in America ads like you'll be seeing in the swing states, those ads are geared towards winning over voters. Some of the ones you see on digital might actually be geared towards winning over only one voter. And that voter, of course, is Donald J. Trump, because sadly enough, our president can be psychologically manipulated by a bunch of Republican GOP operatives. And the reason that they're doing that is that it causes him to lose his train of thought. He can't focus on his own campaign. He starts talking about his water drinking skills and, defending his ramp walking. And he spends time on Twitter and on rallies talking about things that he's not on message. And it's good that they can manipulate him in that way. It's bad for us because it means the guy in charge can also easily be manipulated by foreign leaders. But there's basically multiple things that Lincoln Project is doing simultaneously. Like a three-pronged approach with these ads, getting earned media to get attention, to raise money, to run ads in the swing states. But some of those ads and the Senate ads that will be coming up in the fall really are geared towards winning over Republicans and independents. Now, as the viewer pointed out, or the questioner pointed out, my research is kind of opposite of that, right? I'm focused on Dem coalition and getting Democrats to understand, look, the way that Republicans campaign, you don't hear Republicans on the stump talking about, hey, I've got to get Democrats to cross over and vote for me to win the election, right? And that's the best way to kind of highlight how different Republicans campaign from Democrats, right? And it's not because Republicans have that luxury because there's more of them. I mean, it's actually quite opposite, as I've explained before. So, yes, my research is focused on a different type of campaign technique, but I can chew gum and walk at the same time, and that's what I'm doing with the Lincoln Project.
Now, here's an interesting question from viewer Bart Sullivan. Bart says, in a dream, I was hoping that someone could debate Trump in real time and ask him, if you're so rich, why hide your taxes? If you're so smart, why hide your grades? If you're so sexy, why a porn star? If you're not a coward, why hide in a bunker, etc.? My question for you is whether this type of ad would do any good to help expose Trump for what he is, a fraud, and whether that would help sway the election for some people or get more Democrats out to vote.
Yeah, so, I think that many of us have had the dream of seeing Donald Trump confronted with lines like that in a debate. Unfortunately, the one person I think that was most likely to hit him with something challenging like that would have been Elizabeth Warren, and she's no longer in the race, right? So we're probably not going to be seeing a savvy debate strategy like that. In terms of ads, though, I do think, there's a lot of utility in reminding people that Donald Trump is a man of many walking contradictions. He claims to be smart and he hides his grades, as you pointed out. I think there's a lot of different ad techniques that are going to be used in the cycle. And again, a lot of it comes down to who you're targeting. I think the digital space affords a lot of opportunity to come in and hit people with messaging like that. In terms of the swing state television advertising, though, because of the pandemic and the salience of that pandemic, the power of that is just so attractive that I really would urge that area of focus. I mean, for me, if I was running a swing state strategy against the Senate Republicans or against Trump in these swing states on behalf of Biden, I would be looking to define for the voters. I mean, they have a general sense that the pandemic has been managed poorly and, that they don't approve of Trump's handling of it, but there's so much still to go on that for defining for the voters just exactly what Trump did that was wrong, exactly how wrong it was, especially compared to the international context. And, it was just, you could really pound that message and get so much more out of it if the voters are this unhappy with him without that kind of brutal messaging coming after him. I imagine the blood that you could take out of that rock or whatever, if with a concerted message attack. So that's really, to me, the big frame of this cycle. It didn't have to be this way. It's this way because of Donald Trump's key decisions here and here, and we can't fix it with that man in office, right? So I think that's really, to me, the big message frame of the fall.
All right, let's go to a question from Salman Chaudhry, who asks something that I think is on the mind of a lot of people, whether they're left, right, or center, when thinking about the 2020 election. And he says, first of all, thank you very much for your hard work. Big fan here. And if you can please put to address the biggest argument presented by my Trump 2020 friends whenever they see a poll in which Trump is getting clobbered. They always say, oh, this is what the media said in 2016 also. Trump was supposed to lose in all those states according to the polls, but he won those states. How can I factually rebut that argument? Or are they really onto something and the polls can't be trusted?
Well, it's unfortunate, but if people are, into mask and virus denialism, I doubt that there's much you could say to them to cure poll denialism. However, in terms of, the more legitimate, fixable end of that question, which is, how should people be worried about it this time? I will say in 2016, the national polling actually was quite accurate. It was one of the lowest error rates that we've ever seen in national polling. The way that things got askew really was the forecast and the state polls. The state polling, which there wasn't a lot of, especially in the states that it ended up getting very wrong, because once those polls were so advantaged Clinton, a lot of pollsters just didn't go back in the poll. So when we look at Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, there were some polls there, and they were always very advantaged Clinton. And then, the polling energy didn't really focus there as much as it would have if they had been close. But it turns out that the polling data was sending us a very clear signal. And I won't lie and tell you it's a signal I saw in real time. But when I went back to write my book on the election, it was very clear to me it's something that I should have seen, and I wish I had, because in like a normal presidential election, very few people are undecided, especially coming down the stretch. In 2016, that number was double. And it was double in every poll, and it was double at the state level, and it was double in the national poll. And I like to think if I was me, then, and the me now, then I'd have seen it now, right? Because it was very, very clear when I went back. Oh, wow. The data was sending us a big SOS. We should not have been saying with certainty that Clinton was going to win an election when 12% of the electorate was telling us, hey, I have no idea what I want to do because I hate both of these people, right? And so it was a really clear signal. And I will say this, I have a big tracking sheet of data, some of it polls and some of it other data, but it's a big, big Google sheet that I track. And, this year, that undecided component is very small. It's actually unusually small for July. And, it's that data signal is definitely not a problem this time around. People seem to be pretty deciding pretty early where they want to go. And, third party voting or unsettled, undecided voting is not seeming to be a major factor like it was in 2016. But I think now that people are skeptical and worried about missing something and are really looking for any signal in the data, that there's just a lot less to be worried about. Now, where you should be worried, however, is that there's this giant pandemic going on, and one political party that really isn't even trying to be discreet anymore about its efforts to make it harder for people to vote. I mean, you don't go and sue the Wisconsin state governor who's trying to get a delay for an election in a pandemic unless you really just don't care anymore if people know, hey, I'm trying to suppress votes and make it harder for people to vote. So I think, the uncertainty that we do have is relative to the fact that, Republicans generally feel that, lower turnout or decreased access is a key component to electoral viability for them in the fall. And they're going to be working hard to try to achieve that in different ways, such as, eliminating or keeping from early voting or vote by mail access and things like that. So that's really the uncertainty of 2020.
Okay, so let's turn back to some specific states. Kelly Thompson says, I'd like to get your take on the likelihood of Biden winning Arizona and Florida.
Yeah, so, Arizona last cycle in 2016 had everything that it needed to flip except for one thing, and that was a really motivated electorate. Because as soon as it got a really motivated electorate in 2016, what did it do? It turned blue. It produced a Democratic senator in Kristen Sinema. And it did so even with 2% of the state vote going wasted off to a Green Party protest candidate. So that's a pretty robust victory there. Arizona, I think, looks really good for Democrats. I mean, I actually feel better about Arizona in some ways than I do about Wisconsin. And that is, that was before or without a mismanaged pandemic that has just been a total shit show over there. And I think is just, compounding the GOP's problems because, when we're looking at a couple of states that are going to end up having the worst fatality and carnage problems, it's going to be Arizona, Texas, and Florida, I think. Maybe not technically in terms of population to death, but Arizona's going to be pretty bad. So I think Arizona is really hot to trot. Now, Florida, my model is always really bullish on flipping because the demographics are there. It has a Democratic registration advantage. The difference maker for Florida in 20, other than the enthusiasm factor, which I think is huge, is that the olds are a little bit unhappy right now at the Republican Party. And, a lot of the olds are independents and they usually cast their ballots with the Republicans. But we're seeing in data that some of them are breaking away. They may return to Donald Trump. But unless something happens, I don't know that they're going to, because they've got a really clear message from the Republican Party right now, and that is basically, you're the cure, and you're not more important than this disease or whatever, right? They've basically been told, sacrifice yourselves for the economy. You've lived a nice long life and it's time to check out. And, I'm related to a couple of olds who are Republicans, and they did vote for Trump in 2016. And I think they were planning on voting for Trump. We have very uncomfortable Thanksgivings, as you might imagine, until this pandemic. And I think they have really had a rude awakening in watching Trump navigate this pandemic, seeing him fail to utilize his federal powers, not do a national shutdown, not do test and trace. And then the attitude of, what's a couple 100,000 people more or less, right? Well, since they're kind of the people that, are ostensibly have lived a good life and can be sacrificed, they are feeling like they want to keep living. It's an odd thing, you see, but apparently they're not ready to die. And I'm sensing that the Florida olds are feeling a little bit similarly, and they've really been taken hostage by the DeSantis, pandemic management down there. My olds are at least safely in camped up here in Virginia with good state management. So I think Florida this could be the year for Democrats. There's some other things going on too, as we talked about in that Rick Wilson episode, that really suggests that this could be the year for Florida.
Okay, Rachel, Nelson Aldrich wants to know how Democrats can broaden their appeal to win back rural areas. He says, I know you talk about changing demographics and such, but to pass liberal policies, we need to win the Senate and hold on to it for long stretches like the GOP does. I've heard about some interesting work that party chairs like Jane Kleeb of Nebraska have done to help rehabilitate the Dem image, which led to the most wonderful scene of cowboys on horses marching alongside Native Americans in front of the U.S. Capitol building to protest Keystone XL pipeline. How do we win back rural folks who may benefit from Dem policies more than Republican policies?
Yeah, it's definitely, the problems in rural America are the product of a concerted and unanswered marketing campaign from the Republican Party, from the right, that's been going on for 30 plus years. And it's never been answered because the way that Democrats have dealt with it predominantly have been when they do run a rural candidate or have any traction in a rural area, is to say this candidate is not like the rest of the Democratic Party, right? Which is not a way to deal with the brand problem. So you've got Rush Limbaugh and you've got, Fox News telling and hammering rural America. And I just did a focus group of one with a, generic aggrieved 50-year-old white male in a interaction for a different, just a casual business type interaction yesterday. But I focus grouped him while I had him, and he had a standard list of grievances, but it started off definitely like when he opened the door for the conversation by stating that he was definitely really concerned the Democrats were going to eliminate Mount Rushmore. To him, because he had been told on right-wing media that this was a real threat, that this is a thing that Democrats are talking about and they're going to do it, and it's this is going to happen, right? And until there is a concerted branding pushback that gives a positive message for Democrats and economic liberalism, and more importantly, defines for rural America how economic conservatism has screwed them. And I think that's just as important. I think the best way to actually make your brand look better, and this is exactly what the Republicans have done, right, is to attack the other guy's brand. There is nobody out there in rural America attacking the Republican brand, right? Even when you get a Democrat to run out there that's good, they're basically running by saying, hey, I'm kind of like you guys, right? And that's accepting the frame. There's something wrong with my brand and your brand is better. That's not what I'm talking. Yeah. So you need to go out there. It should be a pretty easy case to make. Rural America has been absolutely decimated by the last 30 years. Lots of that decimation ties back to, Republican economic policies like trade and, free market stuff and wage stagnation and divestment from education and all kinds of things. It should be, easy to go out there and put together a really aggressive platform that makes Democrats sound good by pointing out the inadequacies and the way that Republican economics has hurt rural America. So that's how I would recommend a start. It would not be something that can be fixed in an election cycle either, but you're never going to fix it if you don't get started.
Okay, we've got a really interesting question here from Will Cantwell, who's thinking about the logistics for November. He says, hi, Rachel, big fan of yours and an AP government teacher in high school myself. From what we've seen in primary elections in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, many polling places were closed in urban centers, and there's more reliance on mail-in and absentee ballots. In November, will we see a similar amount of polling places closed in the cities? I'm very hopeful that vote by mail and absentee can achieve the high turnout Democrats need in cities, but if people need to vote in person on Election Day, will they have to wait for hours at a few polling places? Even for public health, it would seem that more polling places would be better for social distancing and mitigating large crowds. What do you think? What are things going to actually look like on Election Day this year?
Yeah, so the people who have worked, again, we talked about Rick and the GOPs. It's like a 20-year effort of teaching people to vote by mail. It is a teaching process. It's not like you just send a vote by mail ballot application out and magically everyone gets it and they do it. The census people will tell you too how difficult that is to execute. So there are going to be millions of Americans who need to vote in person. And if there was one glaring red light of emergency, flashing beacon danger sign in terms of election night, it is these urban polling locations, which are going to be dramatically understaffed and therefore may not be open, right? And we know this for a fact because we just watched in Wisconsin 6 out of 160 polling locations be open. 6 out of 160. And, we saw lines in Georgia. You think that was a line? Imagine general election turnout. A primary election, even when it's robust like it was in Georgia, is just a slither of the electorate. A general election, especially the one that we're envisioning here, that is going to turn out, 65, 70% of the public, even if you cut off, 30% of that, 40% in vote by mail, it's huge turnout. And if you don't have the old people to staff the polling locations, you can't open them. That's what happened in Wisconsin. And the reason is that, those polling locations are staffed predominantly by people age 60 and above. That's our poll working army, and they are not able to do the job because of the pandemic. So I am actually kind of surprised that we haven't seen almost TV PSAs. I kind of expected each state to be panicking a little bit on this topic. In Virginia, I expected by now I'd be seeing on the TV, hey, we need almost like a Peace Corps effort to staff these polling locations. And, I know the Democratic Party is aware of the problem and there might be some groups working on the problem. But to me, it should be an SOS, all hands on deck, everybody freak out thing, because, it's not going to be easy to take a workforce that's normally median age 60 and make it median age 40 in 3 or 4 months lead time. And the only way to do that would be a concerted public announcement effort, a massive recruiting public service, and you have to train them too. It's a paid position. It's a volunteer position that's compensated, but my goodness, it's definitely the biggest threat facing Election Day voting. So I'm happy to have been able to talk about it. And I certainly am hoping to see much more effort on that.
Rachel, this is great. We are cranking through these questions. I think we might have even gotten, say, a full percent, maybe even 2% of the way through our stack. So let's keep it going with Lynn Cairns, who says, "Hi, Rachel. Love following your work. I believe I read a tweet of yours saying Biden could not pick anyone," that's for VP, "with a background in law enforcement, suggesting it shouldn't be Harris or Demings. This week, it seems that you're pushing for Harris. Am I mistaken? And if not, can you explain in a little more detail who your pick would be?"
Yeah, no, I mean, what I have said is that it's dangerous to pick somebody with law enforcement background, that I would assume, like, from the very beginning, anybody with a prosecutorial background or law enforcement, which is the case with Demings as a chief of police, would have already known to vet such an individual even before George Floyd was murdered and we saw the protest of the last couple of months. This is not a new issue. The backlash to police violence and the movement to get some action on this has been building and building over the last few years. So I would assume that, with Kamala Harris, for example, she's always been a front runner since she dropped out of the primary for whoever won to be vice president. And I would assume that with that background, this is something that vetters would have looked at. But after George Floyd got murdered, I would also assume that they went back and looked even closer with a, really fine comb, to really, really be sure there's nothing there. So obviously, if you were to pick a vice president who does not have a law enforcement background or a prosecutorial background, probably mangling that word, then you don't have the risk of something coming up that could be used. And the way it's going to be used, I'm just going to tell you, is that it's what they're doing now. They're taking ads that they run against micro-targeted on Facebook and YouTube, where they target Black voters, and they target Joe Biden on the crime bill, right? And they say Joe Biden passed this bill that was racist, and it came after Black citizens, right? And it's coming from the Trump campaign, so clearly they don't have the best interest of Black voters at heart when they're doing that. It's the goal is to suppress Black voters and get them not to vote for Biden. But if the end result is to help Donald Trump win office, it's clearly not because they have the best interest of Black voters. So it's a suppressive effort. So that's what I was saying. If there's a law enforcement candidate like Demings, you really do need to be very, very, very cautious and make sure that there's not something that can be exploited there.
Okay, Elgin Booth is next, and Elgin would like you to solve the puzzle of Iowa. The question is, what is going on in Iowa? Recent polls have shown Donald Trump with a small lead and Joe Biden as being very unpopular. Yet these same polls have shown the fairly unknown Democratic Senate candidate, Teresa Greenfield, with a small lead over Joni Ernst. So, how would you handicap these two races at this point? Does Iowa have enough registered Democrats and suburban educated voters for both Biden and Greenfield to win?
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because we had this Iowa caucus that literally feels like it never happened. And I mean that literally because I went there. It was like this dream come true trip for me. And I get there and there's no signs of political activity anywhere. I never see any signs, campaign signs. If it wasn't for Amy Klobuchar's bus driving circles around Des Moines the whole time I was there, with no Amy Klobuchar, who is back at the Senate impeachment trial, I don't know that I would ever believed I was in Iowa. No, I went to the caucus, so I know it happened. But anyway, and then of course, it gets reported and it has these mistakes and it takes forever for the results. It really is it's the caucus that never happened. So I was very bearish on Iowa. And then all of a sudden they have this primary for the Senate, and the turnout for the Democrats is just, fantabulous. I mean, so good that the Republicans freak out and have a emergency session or a session of the legislature where they're like, oh, what can we do to make it really hard for people to vote in the fall? Because they're freaking out now after looking at that turnout. I mean, that turnout for the Democrats in that primary was just ginormous. And that just totally reset the whole game because, again, Democrats don't need huge turnout in a primary. We saw in 2018, I tracked primary turnout, and it's idiosyncratic. There were some general election fall races that Democrats won in the wave where the primary turnout had been blah. And there were others where the primary turnout had been an indicator. But it was very noisy as an indicator. But when it was good, strong turnout in the primary, they won all of those races, right? So, and again, Iowa had this huge swing of 15 points between 2012 and 2016, between Obama and Trump. And a lot of that was composition of the electorate change, going from 38% Democrat in 2012 to just 32% in 2016. So I think there's a lot of potential in Iowa.
Okay, well, Adam Rifkin writes a question that I think gets to the heart of one of the key campaign strategy questions this year. He says, is it better for Biden to campaign, or for the Biden campaign to focus on 6 key swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina, or is he better served by spending time in other states too, especially states with flippable Senate seats? And he lists Maine, Colorado, Iowa, Georgia, Montana, Texas, Kansas, Kentucky, and South Carolina. What's your position here in terms of defending the swing states or expanding the map?
Yeah, so this is the same conundrum that Hillary Clinton faced in 2016. And, there was a ton of pressure on that campaign to help expand the Senate map. And the reason, of course, was that they needed control of the Senate if the Clinton presidency was going to do anything. Control and, it was going to be a very tough map to get control. Biden's going to be in the same position. And I would assume within the room where it happens in the Biden campaign, there's division on this topic. Because obviously the conservative approach would be, no. This is the mistake we made in 2016. We need to keep our eyes very focused on these 6 swing states, especially that upper Midwest quadrant. No matter what those polls say, we can't keep our, we had to keep our feet on the gas and really focus our activity there and just, hammer that wall, and we can't get distracted by other things. And then, there's gonna be, they need a pretty big expansion. They have to have North Carolina as that 4th pivot seat. But getting a 50-seat tie with a tie-breaking vice presidential vote in the Senate, that's not ideal. They really would need or should have a buffer in the Senate. So, and you can't have that unless you send Biden other places and get him to do more help on the down ticket stuff. So it's going to be a real, I think, a line of contention. Now, it's a problem that gets solved a little bit by money, like a glutton of resources. So the more money that the Biden campaign has and the Democratic, campaigns have, the less of a problem this is, because they're not having to be picky about where they're spending. So, it's a problem that could solve itself by people being generous and giving a lot of money. And that's one reason, you don't really want the narrative of, oh, it's all in the bag and we've got this campaign. You want people feeling, intense and ready to give money. But, I think ultimately, if I was running the campaign and I was Jen O'Malley Dillon, I would be looking to do both, actually, but I would never take my foot off the gas in that Midwest 3. No matter how much polling says I was winning, I'm going to bury those 3 states, and I am just going to make sure that there's no way I can lose them.
Okay, let's go to Cade Elkins, whose question is, I totally get your strategy of tying Trump to GOP incumbents with a steel cord, to borrow the phrase from Mr. Schiff. But how should groups craft their messaging in red states who love Trump? I ask because I'm a member of a tiny teacher-organized PAC in West Virginia. Thanks so much for your honest and brutal analysis. The Dems absolutely need that. And I would just offer as an aside that honest and brutal analysis is absolutely your hallmark and stock in trade, Rachel. And as a Republican, I would say it's not just Democrats that need that. That is what people of all political stripes in the country need more of right now, is your particular brand of honest and ruthlessly brutal analysis. So with that, let us know what you think about this question in terms of how Democrat campaigns might want to position themselves in red states where you might have more widespread sympathies or support for the Trump campaign.
Yeah, so longtime viewers and fans will know that I'm deeply skeptical of the Indiana, Missouri, Claire McCaskill, Joe Donnelly trying to run, okay, I'm going to support Trump's agenda, trying to, in 2018, that obviously didn't work, right? And I just question the efficacy of that strategy. But when you're in a really deeply red state like West Virginia or say Kentucky, like here's where here's a tweak on that strategy I think is really interesting, and it's coming from Amy McGrath and her campaign in Kentucky, because she's not doing the regular, hey, I'm in this deep red state, so I have to run like I like the opposition party president or senator or whatever strategy that Dr. B is so, usually dismal about. What she's doing is the strategy is actually a psychological manipulation, and insofar as she is telling Kentucky voters that Mitch McConnell has not been good, has not been supportive enough of Trump, right? So she's basically gambling. She's actually, what the strategy does is it makes use of the Bitecofer rule number 1, what we were talking about on Twitter, which is never overestimate the intelligence of the voters, right? And that's not, you think about that wording is very intentional. Never overestimate the intelligence of the voter. What that campaign is doing is they are banking on the fact that out there in Kentucky, there are at least some Republican people who don't know enough about politics, don't understand it enough, who might hear her message and say, oh, this nice lady is saying that Mitch doesn't support Trump enough, and she will, and I'm going to vote for her. And if you're skeptical about that working, well, let me just tell you, I'm going to be doing a very fabulous special on direct mail and messaging, and I'm going to show you a great race here in Virginia in the state legislature last year, in which in the closing days, when the Republican incumbent knew he was probably going to lose his seat, he decided to close out by tying his Democratic challenger to Trump, because she wasn't, doing it. So he tied her to Trump and framed her as, connected to Trump, and he ended up winning by 400 votes. It was a great strategy. Obviously it would not work with a super intelligent electorate, which again, we don't have. And I just is one of my favorite things that ever happened in politics. So I'll be definitely showing it to you.
All right, now let's hear from Chris Solly. Chris says, hi, Doc Bitecofer. I think Vote Save America's Adopt a State program is a really cool idea. At this point, I wonder which of their 6 states you think is the tipping point state. And for viewers, those 6 states are Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. Chris says, that's the state I would like to adopt. What do you think?
Ooh, this is tough. Tipping point state. I mean, I'm torn, I'm a little bit torn on this one. Like, my first impulse might be Florida, because, if not this time, never, right? I mean, you've got the old people, again, especially the independent older people, are really angry about the pandemic and the mismanagement, and they haven't even been hit yet with effective messaging about it that really hammers home what went wrong, why it went wrong, and how terrible it is. And then, so like, to me, I mean, obviously Florida's a huge, huge win for Democrats, but then I wonder too about North Carolina, because then it's a double dip. I mean, you get that's the 4th seat for the Senate for the Democrats, for the majority maker. That's the majority maker. And then of course, it's a huge, I mean, you could take North Carolina and do, you could lose Wisconsin and have North Carolina, right? Oh, I don't know. Gosh, that's really, but those are 2, I think, that would be probably for me on the list.
And with that, Rachel, I'm afraid we're just about out of time, so we're going to have to do another one of these very soon, because while we've made a pretty good dent in the mailbag, we still have stacks and stacks of unanswered questions, which we do want to get to. In the meantime, as I said, visit us at electionwhisperer.com, subscribe to the channel, reach out to us with your questions, catch up on back episodes, and we'll see you next time.
All right.